Welcome back. Take a few seconds. Give yourself a little time. I am very glad you're here for our discussion of natural selection and heritability. Quite a bit of this is overview, and it's going to move pretty quickly. It's things that you are very familiar with from genetics, but we're just going to pop that into an evolution context. If I can get my screen to cooperate. Okay, just going to think about all those things that you learned about in genetics, and we're going to use that understanding to inform sort of our early discussion of natural selection. So remember at the very beginning we talked about the way we're defining natural selection is any consistent difference in fitness among different classes of biological entities. And one of the ways that we can define fitness is reproductive success. So how much reproductive success does each class have, or each character state is another way that we can think about it now that we have that terminology. In thinking about reproductive success, this contains both the concept of survival and reproduction, because obviously if an organism doesn't survive to reproduce, it didn't reproduce, right? It's not producing fitness. So this includes both the concept of survival and reproduction. And just reminding you that we talked about the fact that whatever it is that we're talking about, whatever character state it is that we're talking about, it has to be heritable or it doesn't matter. Remember, has to be heritable. So evolutionary change occurs from generation to generation, reminding you of that. So we have to have heritability. And so bringing those two things together, what that sort of means, this is not cooperating with me, is that we have to have a genotype, whatever the genotype is, whatever's going on at the genetic level, has to affect the phenotype. Whatever's changes are happening in the genome, they gotta affect the phenotype. So remember, the phenotype is what actually makes up those character states, right? So the phenotype is the blue rabbit. The phenotype is the number of toes. So changes in the genotype have to affect the phenotype, and hopefully you remember from genetics that we can have a lot of changes in the genome that then don't affect the phenotype. Remember, we can have changes in our codons that don't change the amino acid, for example. So the genotype has to affect the phenotype. And then the phenotype has to affect fitness. So we have to have this whole situation. Genotype has to affect phenotype. Phenotype has to affect fitness for natural selection to occur. And I think that this probably all really makes sense, but what we're doing is we're putting these sort of intuitive concepts into a clear definition or a clear explanation. The genotype has to affect the phenotype has to affect the fitness, and this has to be heritable, right? Okay, so reminding you of some things from genetics. Remember that when we're thinking about an organism, when we're thinking about an organism's genome, if the two white lines are representing two chromosomes, homologous chromosomes, the two blue lines are representing another set of homologous chromosomes, all I've done is label 3 genes on one set of homologous chromosomes and 2 genes on the other set of homologous chromosomes. And we know that it's far more complex than that. We have far more genes than that. And for each gene, I've labeled 2 alleles. An organism in and of itself, a diploid organism, can only have 2 alleles at a time, but each gene can have lots of alleles, right? So we have sort of, if we're going to simplify it to this arrangement, we're interested in these 5 genes. We remember from genetics that whenever this diploid organism is going to produce a gamete, we can have crossing over and recombination in the process of meiosis. So that shuffles which alleles are associated with which alleles, right? So that's how we produce a gamete. And if you're like, what? Go back to meiosis and remind yourself of this process. So we produce a gamete, we go through crossing over and recombination that can completely shuffle which alleles are on which chromosome that makes it into the gamete. And remember, gametes are haploid. So what I've done here is just looking at 2 chromosomes, 5 genes, given 3 examples, which there would be more, of potential combinations of ways that these alleles can be shuffled. Hopefully you remember this from genetics. And in our sexually reproducing organism, so this will have gamete 1 on the left. It's going to combine with gamete 2 on the right. And so we might have alleles that are dominant combined with alleles that are recessive. We might have codominant alleles. We might have alleles that are affecting other genes in the system. We might have different types of transcription factors. All of these different types of combinations that can happen in the resulting offspring. So the point of reminding you of all of this, like in humans, just humans, and evolution happens in everything, right? We have 20 to 25,000 protein coding genes. That's a lot. So there's a ton of potential shuffling that happens. So an organism, in this case I'm using a human as an example, does not pass itself. An organism does not pass itself as an organism on to its offspring. That's not how this works, right? We know that intuitively, but it's important to grasp that concept. So parent does not pass its genome intact onto its offspring. So when we're thinking about evolution, we're very often thinking about it at the allelic level. And we're thinking about the changes in frequency of alleles over the course of generations. Because the alleles, which alleles an organism has, is going to be what produces its genotype. So over the course of generations, we might see an increase in frequency of one genotype over a decrease in frequency over another genotype. And we often talk about this as changes in allelic frequencies. And just to remind you of the way that, just to remind you of things that you already know, I'm sure. But if this is genotype A here, whatever that genotype is, if we're discussing evolution, genotype A is going to produce a phenotype. Genotype B is going to produce a different phenotype. And natural selection acts at the level of the phenotype. I'll show you kind of an example of what I mean. Super simplified example. So let's imagine this is imaginary world and an environment, made up environment, where there's 2 different types of substrate. There's 2 different types of ground cover. There's red ground cover and there's the sort of purplish blue ground cover. And this species then has variation. It has some individuals who have the dominant allele. And remember, if they have the dominant allele, whatever's going on here is going to get masked. So that might be the recessive allele, or it might also be the dominant allele. So we've got individuals with this allele, this genotype, and so that genotype then makes their phenotype red. Because some of the ground cover is red, they're well camouflaged. Cool, they can hide from predators. Then over here, I don't have an arrow that color, we have individuals who have a different genotype. If this is a recessive allele, they have to be homozygous recessive if they're going to be the blue phenotype. We have substrate, we have ground cover that's the similar color. Cool. We have all these little individuals represented by the circles that are able to camouflage, and they are able to hide from predators. And now let's imagine that something happens, the environment changes, and much of that sort of purple blue substrate disappears. There's a blight, there's a whatever, something changes. And the red substrate grows, extends. So now these organisms that are this blue color, because of their genotype, are more visible to predators. And if they're more visible to predators, then they're going to get eaten, right? So what happens is that the frequency of the allele that confers the adaptive phenotype is going to increase in frequency. And the allele that confers what is now the maladaptive phenotype, because of a change in the environment, is going to decrease in frequency. So this is how a real life example where the effect is on the whole organism gets eaten, right? If a predator can see the blue dot, it's going to eat the whole blue dot. But what we see as a result, because the blue dot is encoded by this specific allele, this specific genotype, is we see the change at the allelic frequency level. So you're going to get many, many more individuals who have this allele in the population over time than you will individuals who have this allele in the population over time. Okay. So we'll come back in our next set of lectures, dig deeper into natural selection, levels of selection, sexual selection, and I will see you then.